Hello and welcome to Newsbreak Chats. I'm Chay Hofileña, the editor of Newsbreak, the investigative and in-depth section of Rappler. This week, we're publishing a 4-part series on domestic workers who experienced abuse by diplomats. This months-long project was put together by a team of 3 led by journalist Ana Santos, who is joining our discussion remotely from Berlin. Ana worked with Rappler reporter Michelle Abad and forensics researcher Pauline Macaraeg for stories that went beyond Philippine shores. We learned that some of the diplomats who hired workers were employees of embassies, consulates, and even international agencies like the World Bank. To escape from abusive working conditions, some were left with no choice but to escape. The stories are heart-wrenching. Kukwento nila Ana, Michelle, and Pauline ang mga discoveries nila. But these stories of migrant workers are also inspiring for their show of resilience and fortitude. We are fortunate to have the 3 ladies with us to share their insights about diplomats and the recurring problem of domestic worker abuse. Welcome to Newsbreak Chats, ladies. Hi, Ana. Hi, hello sa Berlin.
Thank you for having me.
And we have Pauline. Welcome, Pauline, and Michelle.
Hi. Here.
Okay, let's start muna with Ana. Ana muna sa Berlin. How did this multi-series project start?
You know, Chay, there are some stories that kind of already start following you. Yung may storya na siya mismo yung lalapit sa'yo para i-tell mo. So this idea for this story actually came out while I was investigating the trafficking of migrant truck drivers in the Netherlands. So while I was there, I met Cora Espanto, who is the first person that we featured in the first series. Cora works for an anti-trafficking NGO, and she's also the chairperson of Migrante. And while we were working on the truck drivers, si Ate Cora, let me describe her to you. She's 7 years old. She's not much taller than me, and I'm like 5 foot nothing. And she dressed in jeans and in a shirt and in sneakers, very preppy sneakers. Tapos may jacket kasi malamig.
Okay.
Pero lagi siya na mabilis. Ana, alam mo, pagkatapos ng truck drivers, gusto mo yung mga kasambahay na na-abuse naman ng mga diplomat? And sabi ko, ano po yun? Anong ganap? And so she started telling me about domestic workers who were abused by diplomats. And I thought, madami bang ganon, Ate Cora? And it turns out, that's how she had actually started becoming very active in the space of advocating for labor rights.
So paano niya, Ana, curious lang ako, paano niya naman narinig tong mga stories na to? Parang matagal na ba yung stories na to and then she had to share it with you kasi walang nagsusulat?
Yes, that's one story. That's one aspect of it. Yung marami siyang nai-encounter. At remember her work, she's primarily para siyang case manager, di ba? Or siya yung tumutulong sa mga domestic workers sa Netherlands. So maraming dumadaan sa kanya na cases, hindi masyado nare-report. And at the same time, Cora was also one of the first who went public with her face to say that I am Cora Espanto. I have been trafficked by a diplomat. And she has been talking about this for many years. And off and on, merong magiging feature, merong magiging news report, pero sabi niya, nangyayari pa rin at nangyayari. And she knows firsthand how hard it is when you have to go against a person who has diplomatic immunity. And that's usually a diplomat or an employee of an international organization.
We noticed, no, kasi we've published several stories already. Medyo baka expensive yung ganitong klaseng storya, di ba? Because hindi lang siya nag-focus dito sa Pilipinas, but there were stories na kinover din sa iba't ibang bansa. And I know that si Michelle, for example, alam ko na bumiyahe pa siya sa Hong Kong. So a project like this can be quite expensive. So merong mga reporters and journalists who probably would want to do these types of stories. Paano ba to nagiging posible? Lalo na kung medyo expensive siya.
Background lang natin, bakit natin kinailangan to go to the different countries? Kasi again, this story kind of followed us. Nag-umpisa tayo sa Netherlands, di ba? Cora Espanto saying, hindi masyado nare-report itong mga ganitong issue. And then I moved to Berlin. And I started looking for women's organizations here, and I found one, Banying. If you look on their website, specifically they said we assist domestic workers who are exploited by diplomats. Wow! May NGO that focuses on this and has actually put it out on their webpage. So this is a big problem. And so we went from the Netherlands to Berlin. We said if this is a problem in these two countries, what more in the diplomatic centers like New York and in Switzerland? And that's how we came up with the idea of doing a more global report. To your question, yes, it was costly because there were a lot of countries that we went to, and we were able to fund this project with two grants. One from the Journalism Fund Europe, which explicitly their grant conditions are it must be a cross-border project. And we also had to get a supplemental grant from the Pulitzer Center to cover our costs of travel and other incidental costs for putting this together.
I would think that because nga this is cross-border, no, parang it's not easy to coordinate. Parang mas madali kung kunyari you're based in one country and you work with journalists who are also in that same country. Pero kung iba't ibang bansa, medyo mas mahirap. May changes sa oras, tapos kahit yung availability, yung sources, paghabol sa mga sources, hindi rin ganon kadali. How were you able to surmount this?
Well, we had a signal group that was really helpful in terms of putting together a centralized point of communication. And I think I have to apologize for the team because I am 6 hours behind, and sometimes I would send texts that I don't realize are super late in the evening in Manila, just because I get excited about something or there's a new update. And we also had to have weekly meetings with the other team members. You see the three of us here, but this was actually a project that was put together by a wider team of analysts and a data person who had to build our database also. So there were a lot of people that were involved in the team, and it really took, I think, a lot of, first, the coordination part was important, but also outlining the responsibilities of each and every person. And yun na nga, their patience with me because I'm 6 hours behind and I end up texting sometimes on a Sunday, I don't realize it, or Sunday pa dyan sa Manila and I'm already texting, or gabi na dyan sa Manila and I'm texting.
Sige. Interesting lang kasi I wanted to start lang with that aspect of this project. Yung hindi nakikita ng iba, no? The coordination and the work behind the scenes. But as you pointed out nga, this is really a story that needed to be told, and siguro secondary yung cost kasi nga parang kailangan merong lumapit and persistent yung problema. But I'll jump siguro dun sa ano ba yung na-discover ninyong tatlo, Pauline and Michelle, siguro you'd want to share what struck you. Michelle, mauna ka.
Actually, I think I would like to defer to Pauline first for this question because since she did the data investigation, or she wrote a lot of the data investigation, that was where we started to really get the major findings. And then I'll add later on about the case studies and the presence of impunity.
Okay.
Yeah,
so you started?
Yeah.
Okay.
So as Ana mentioned, we built a database of the incidents ng abuse of migrant domestic workers. So as for the data findings, we found that wage theft is the most common type of abuse reported by these domestic workers.
What is wage theft?
Ito yung mga hindi nagbabayad ng proper wages dun sa employees nila. So it can be kulang yung binabayad or hindi talaga nagbibigay ng bayad at all. Merong cases dun sa database na nakita namin na kina-confiscate yung ATM ng workers nila. Or
These are diplomats, ha?
Yeah, the diplomats. Okay. Or nagwi-withdraw sila mismo from the ATM cards of their employees. Meron din yung mga cases na after sweldohan, pinapagbayad naman yung workers nila for some arbitrary payments like lodging, for example, or internet use. So, yun, we noticed that it was where exploitation usually starts, sa wage theft. Kasi based sa details that we obtained, there were 147 out of 208 workers, that's 71% na nag-report ng wage theft. And then what's worse is that marami sa mga workers in our database did not just report one type of abuse. So apart from wage theft, meron pa dyan yung mga nag-report ng forced labor, psychological abuse, emotional abuse, and so on.
How did you put together this database? Kasi parang, di ba, reporters would usually, lalo na pag ganito, anecdotal siya. Like yung kwento nga ni Ana, kinuwento ni Ate Cora, so i-document mo yon. But how do you even begin to put together a database?
I think that took up the bulk of the duration of the project, actually, kasi we really had to create a database. Kasi prior to this, what we had were, separate news reports, legal documents, na hindi naman consolidated. So that's what we did. We had to consolidate that. So we consolidated these accounts into one database that we can refer to para ma-establish natin yung patterns, kung meron ba talaga. That's what we wanted to find out. Kung ano ba yung mga trends, kung meron pang paulit-ulit. Those types of things. So, we started with those na available to us already, like yung mga court documents, yung mga anecdotes from the interviews that we had with those people. And then we also complemented it with a digital investigation. So what we did, we looked for other available information online. So nag-keyword search kami for more news reports, and then we found more case files from NGOs, more court records na hindi pa namin nakikita before. So yun, and then we manually created the results to ensure the accuracy of the details that we gathered and to also make sure na walang umulit.
So how long did it take for you to build this database?
And
how many
months, really?
Yeah, go Ana.
Yeah, it was really a long time, but also I just wanted to add to what Pauline said.
Yeah.
So one source that we really thought was really interesting, our data analyst went through legal journals that documented cases of domestic worker abuse. And in the footnotes, that's where he would look and to see, may court case number, so on and so forth. Tapos tsaka niya i-google yun. Or merong name na ganito, tsaka niya hahanapin. So apart from all of those other open source data, it went to that kind of granular search of examining footnotes in law journals to look for cases and incidents.
So mabusising trabaho to.
Yeah, we really wanted to make sure about the integrity of the whole database. The whole fact-checking process was something that we all worked on in the team, where we divided our cases that ended up almost around 200 cases, where we went through all of the details, whether that names of the workers if available, the names of the diplomat, the type of abuse that was that happened to them. And we went through those cases one by one to make sure that every single one was accurate. And that was not just one pass. That was like 3 eyes looked at that. We even, got another person on the team just to check everything one more time.
So how many were involved in putting together the database?
5.
Yeah,
around 5 of us.
right?
5 of
5
you,
people,
and it took how many months?
Around maybe 3 months or 4 months, I would say.
4 months?
I think it was longer.
Yeah.
Because we had to go through the design. We also had to check. I'm thinking back conceptually, right? The design of the database. What do we want to find out? And then what methods of checking would be employed. So I think I would start it from there. And that it was the first time for me to work on a data project like this. So to really discuss it also with the data forensics team, Pauline's team, is this correct? I know what we need to find out, but if we were to zoom out and look at the steps data-wise, is this how it works? Then to actually see what was feasible, and then to build that database. We went through it so many times, and I think again, our data analyst was really quite patient, because every time they would do a pass, we'd be like, no, we need to add another aspect. Gender, what about gender? I'm sure, what about, we found one case where there are men. So kailangan ipapalabas natin yun, meron palang men. Okay, babalik na naman.
One case lang ng male?
There
No,
were
no,
more.
there were more.
Okay.
But the database was dominated by women
Yeah.
talaga.
Okay. Sige, let's go back to the numbers. Parang what patterns did you see, and were the numbers disturbing for you when you were seeing these patterns already?
Yeah, they are, because at the very least, I think we were able to confirm our hypothesis that there are diplomats getting away with, abusing their workers through the help of diplomatic immunity. In our database, we found that there were 13% of the cases that we found, that 16 out of 122, the complaints and cases were dismissed. And majority of this were due to diplomatic immunity. Another 8 cases were also not brought to court anymore. Kasi, yun nga, gaya ng sabi ni Ana kanina, maraming nagsasabi na madidismiss din naman yan because of diplomatic immunity. So they did not bother anymore. And then may isang case din na din-drop entirely due to intimidation of the employer, the diplomat. So at first glance, we thought, when we were reviewing our data, we thought na, baka it's not that bad naman. Kasi more than half of the cases, maraming favorable decisions, like kunwari awarded by the court yung migrant workers for some compensation or things like that. But, that's the thing with data. I think it's not enough to look just at the numbers, because when we look more closely at the specific cases, we found that more often than not, yung mga awarded cases or yung mga settlements, those did not necessarily mean payment or justice. Kasi bihira lang yung entire amount yung nababayad dun sa workers, kahit na meron ng court order, kahit meron ng settlement.
Could you give us an idea of how much? Yung amounts lang.
I think the highest amount awarded was $3.3 million. That's about
Dollars?
183.7 million pesos. Anna, I can't recall, but this was the case with a Australian diplomat. No, it's an American diplomat based in Australia, right? Yeah.
This is the husband and wife.
Yeah, the husband and wife.
Team, and it was the husband who was abusive, but he died.
But he died, yeah.
Read the story. Be sure to read the story.
Yeah. And then meron ding cases where the diplomats agreed to settle on the condition na hindi sila in-name. So, in effect, parang escaping accountability rin yun, kasi walang record of them abusing their workers. So, may mga ganong klaseng nuances that we saw in the data.
Michelle, curious naman ako, kasi Pauline was looking at numbers and patterns, no? But I understand you spoke to people, you interviewed people. Was there anyone who stood out na yung kwento niya talagang, siguro bukod dun sa kwento ni Ate Cora, no? Na nandun sa part 1 ng series. Meron ba on your part na parang, wow, talagang kakaiba to, ibang klase tong storyang to?
Well, for my part, I actually focused on 2 case studies. Both of them were Filipino workers who worked in Berlin for diplomats. One was a Turkish diplomat, and another one was an Omani diplomat. And both of them actually stand out to me for different reasons. One is because the first worker is named Ellen, and Ellen worked in Germany 10 years ago. And what's striking to me about that is that there's no justice until now, 10 years later, and it's unlikely, or there's no certainty whether she might ever be able to exact accountability from her employer that she accused of overwork and wage theft as well. But the other one, Sally, she was also just employed during the pandemic. So she was in Berlin during the pandemic. She was able to escape that employer as well. But what struck me about her, even if it's just recent, is that she has this very fighting spirit, and she was also very spiteful about. She was very spiteful about what happened, and she spoke with such courage in such a sense that even her translator, when she was speaking to authorities about possibly exacting accountability from her diplomat employer, sinabi daw sa kanya ng translator na, ang tapang mo. And then she said, hindi ako natatakot sa kanya. Like, kahit awayin ko
Filipina
yun.
ako eh.
Exactly. So like, both of them stand out to me in a different way. But both of them are still both showing resiliency, and they're both brave to come out and tell their stories. And even they didn't even request for anonymity. They really want to tell this story.
Balik lang ako sa'yo, Ana. Kasi napaka-interesting nung storya ni Ate Cora, di ba? Kasi story of, ikaw na magkwento, briefly. What was so striking and special about Ate Cora?
I think, first of all, the personality of Cora. I started to tell you about her. She looks like a grandma. She's 70 years old. So please try to imagine in your head a bubbly grandma who speaks very fast. But also how everything about her now is about fighting for migrant worker rights. I'll give you an example. Ang laman ng bag ni Ate Cora ay biscuit kasi mahaba daw ang biyahe minsan, so magugutom siya. So she has Sky Flakes, plain flavor. And then she has, of course, her wallet at yung ID ko, Ana, kasi baka itigil ako. Okay? And then her phone and always flyers about anti-trafficking measures and anti-trafficking organizations. Sabi ko, ganyan. Sa trap, meron daw siya makikita na someone who looks like a migrant or someone who might kind of lost in the city, ibibigay daw niya. Sabi ko, action nila sa'yo. Sabi niya, ibigay daw niya yung flyer. Tapos minsan daw, karamihan daw be like, no. And then she'll smile and say, no. Depende kung sino kausap niya, English or Tagalog. No. You might find someone who needs this information. Just keep it. Tapos magbibigay daw siya ng calling card niya. So this is how passionate this woman is about advocating for migrant worker rights. And then when we retraced her story, where does this come from? Diba? Kakaiba kasi talaga yung how she has incorporated it into her life. And when we looked at her story, she was working for a diplomat in the Netherlands, a Saudi Arabian diplomat, along with her 2 children. She brought her 2 children along with her because she saw it as an opportunity to be with them. 7 years na siyang hindi makakauwi. And it was her son who said na, paano mo natiis to na ganito katagal? Alipin ang tingin nila sa atin. Alipin ang pagtrato nila sa atin. And that's when she first saw her work as domestic servitude. Tapos hanggang ngayon, Chay, umiiyak siya when she tells that story. And when she spoke to me about it, her words were nearly like she was asking for forgiveness herself, na gusto ko lang naman makasama sila eh. Naisip ko, 3 na kami sa sweldo. Tapos matutulungan namin yung pamilya namin sa Pilipinas. And she didn't realize until her son had spoken to her in that way na yung hirap ko, pinasok ko pa pala sa kanila. So I saw that a lot of her work is also trying to repair or make up for that part of her life where she inadvertently and unintentionally subjected her own children to the domestic servitude that she was working under.
You know what's also kind of shocking and enraging in this series is diplomats to eh. Parang, sige, you hear about worker abuse, sa ordinaryong tao, yung employed ng kung sino-sino lang. But these are diplomats. They belong to embassies, consulates, and they work in international organizations. Sabi ko nga kanina, sa World Bank. And yet, may mga abuses na ganito. Tapos yung nabanggit ni Pauline kanina, yung diplomatic immunity. Ano ba kasi yung diplomatic immunity na yan? Ano ba yung paliwanag dyan? Dahil ba may diplomatic immunity, hindi sila pwedeng kasuhan, hindi sila pwedeng habulin? Pauline or Ana? Pauline, ikaw naman.
Okay.
Sige.
Yung diplomatic immunity, it's something that protects diplomats and employees of international organizations and their immediate family members from civil and criminal suits while they are working in the receiving countries kung saan sila nag-work as diplomats. It's needed kasi countries have different, views or political agendas. So diplomatic immunity is needed to maintain that sort of balance within the countries para maging efficient pa rin yung pag-conduct ng duties ng diplomats.
Okay. So clear naman na meron siyang cons, di ba? Merong dangers pag masyadong nai-invoke yung diplomatic community, immunity rather. Pero ano naman yung necessity of having it as protection for diplomats? Okay ba yun? Why is it needed? Ana?
Siguro mag-cite
Yeah.
example. So siguro I can cite an example of why diplomatic immunity is. Kasi yun din ang recurring question sa amin eh. Kung ito yung nagiging enabler for migrant domestic worker abuse, why do we need it? Diba? So the diplomatic immunity is really essential in some respect when it comes to international relations. Let's use an example, yung very fragile relationship natin with China. You know, so we have an ambassador in China right now. And whatever happens, so protected siya by diplomatic immunity. He cannot be sued civilly or criminally by any entity in that country, whether as indirect or direct retaliation for the Philippines in asserting its claim. We have to remember the ambassador is like the little president or the representative of our president, the Philippines, to China. So if there's some kind of retaliatory action against him, it's very symbolic, right, of how it is attacking the country that he represents. So diplomatic immunity in that example will protect him from any kind of retaliation or suit just for a claim that we're making on the West Philippine Sea, for example.
Sige. This has been a recurring problem. Meron ba kayong naisip na solutions maybe? What can be done to help our domestic workers na hindi lang dito sa Pilipinas, no, as you have reported, parang pati sa India meron, sa Indonesia meron. So it's a global phenomenon na involving not only Filipino diplomats but even diplomats from other countries. So paano solusyon dito, or how do we mitigate it?
There's an example that we can look at. It's in Switzerland. And so in 1995, the Swiss government made a mediation pool, and it's called the Office of the Amiable Compositeur. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But basically, it's a mediation pool, and it's made specifically for cases that involve diplomatic immunity. So in cases where workers find themselves wanting to file cases, sometimes it's not immediately available, and so they can go into this mediation pool, and that's where they can try to find some sort of solution. The International Labour Organization actually regards this office as a good practice, and other countries should be adopting a similar intervention method, according to Jean-Pierre Garbad, which is a lawyer that I interviewed about this, who has handled several cases of domestic workers who filed cases against diplomats. So this is an example, because this is unique to Switzerland. He noted that a lot of the places where diplomats have cases, like, for example, there isn't something like this in Kuwait or the Philippines, for example. So that's something that countries can look at. But going back to the question of, how can we, fix this? It's a difficult question, and the diplomatic community is under the Vienna Convention, right? But the international community was the one that created this Vienna Convention. So that the question is also, why would the international community change something that also benefits and protects them?
Ana, do you have anything to add to that?
I think we had to defend this funding for this project. When we first got feedback from the fund, they said, what's the something new that you bring to this story? Because abuse of domestic workers by diplomats is actually an open secret. And so we had to defend, the way that we would investigate this project by showing the scale and the magnitude of the impunity. And I think we were able to show that, because very much like the church scandals, we saw that the diplomats were either conveniently reassigned when there was a court case against them. And that's why it was also very difficult to enforce judgments. Or they just returned to their home country, where they would carry on doing their diplomatic duties, speaking about human rights. So I think that was one of the first glaring things that we saw. And if that's it, then what was the response to bring down the church as an institution and make it accountable for its sex scandals? I think the diplomat community will have to also take stock in that way similarly. Of course, it's a matter nearly of policing their own, right? That they have to hold certain diplomats to account. Where have we seen actions actually moving towards that? Michelle mentioned one, which is the mediation organization or a work tribunal. We also saw in the U.S. they rolled out in-person welfare check-ins nationwide. So they started this in Washington, D.C. as a pilot case, and then the State Department confirmed to us that they are already going to roll this out nationwide. What's an in-person welfare check-in? Let's say I am a domestic worker working for a diplomat. I will have to check in with the authorities personally to renew my documents. And during that time, they will ask me, how's it going? Are you being paid properly? Are you being treated fairly? And that is a preventive case, a preventive measure to prevent further abuse. And secondly, I think this really sends the signal to diplomats that, hey, somebody's watching. There's a way for you to get caught.
Yeah.
And for you to be held accountable. So that's also a very powerful measure, these in-person welfare check-ins. Some countries in Europe are doing it. Not all are, but at least in the United States, and that should set a standard for how the community can stand up and start preventing more migrant domestic worker abuse.
Thank you for doing this story, Pauline, Ana, and Michelle. It's very, very important because, as you mentioned, hush-hush to eh. If it's an open secret, somebody needs to expose it para malaman ng mga tao na hindi to chismis lang, but totoong nangyayari. And it has to be documented, and the database is proof of that, na merong actual cases at merong actual na judgments din. Yun nga lang, hindi lahat na i-implement or na-execute yung judgments. It's important for journalists to do stories like this, kahit na medyo mahirap. And the cross-border aspect of it also highlights the significance of the issue. Siguro, what needs to be done, dahil nailabas na yung information, is for international groups, migrant workers groups, to exert international pressure on maybe diplomats and other international agencies para yung standards naman ma-uphold, no, for workers and laborers, not just in the Philippines, but worldwide, in Asia or kung saan man yan. There are a lot of issues that we need to tackle related to this, but we hope you continue reading the stories related to this very, very important issue. Stories of Michelle will be coming soon, and so far we've published 3 stories, and if you want to read more and understand diplomatic immunity, that story is also available. It's an explainer. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to more difficult and challenging stories like these from Ana, Michelle, and Pauline. This is Chay Hofileña, and this is Newsbreak Chats.